So with that, let me introduce June Lowery Kingston from the European Commission. She is a senior expert and a quality coordinator at DG CNECT, and she was instrumental during the time when the Web Accessibility Directive maybe was not born, but in the youth of the of the directive. So I'm very happy that June has accepted to make the first keynote for us today. And I will stop sharing so we can see you better.
Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me as well as see me.
We both hear and see you, yes.
Great. Okay. Well, huge thanks to you, Susanna, to IAAP and EDF and your sponsors for organising the event. So its full title, since it's its birthday, Directive EU 2016/2102 on the accessibility of the websites and mobile applications of the public sector bodies. And since that is such a mouthful, I'll refer to the directive from now on in our EU shorthand as the WAD, that's W-A-D. And thank you, Susanna, for that fantastic explanation and introduction to the directive. I'll try very hard not to repeat anything you say. It is complemented by two implementing acts, that is Commission decisions, one on what an accessibility statement should contain, and one on both the monitoring methodology. So as you said, how and what the member states should check to show progress or to show the state of play in their country. And in that one as well, on how they should report to the Commission on their findings every 3 years. And the second exercise has just closed. And as you said, why are we celebrating really 5 years today when the directive was adopted back in 2016? There are lots of dates around EU legislation, and particularly this piece. But 23rd September 2020 was the date by which all the websites of the public sector bodies had to be accessible. So it's really the main date of application. And so traditionally, thanks to IAAP and EDF, we celebrated a day as the birthday of the WAD. And so that is an opportune moment to reflect on what's changed thanks to this first EU-wide accessibility law. Now, I wasn't there when negotiations were underway that led to that text being adopted, but I think it's pretty clear they sought to find a balance between the agreed need to improve public sector accessibility and to set a good and a necessary example also to others, which we'll come back to perhaps later, the cost to the public purse, as you mentioned, and the wish to encourage and support market innovation based on the technology of the time and the expectations of how that technology would develop as far as accessibility is concerned. So please bearing in mind the French saying, la critique est aisée, mais l'art est difficile. It's easy to criticize, especially with hindsight, but art is difficult. I'm going to share my really personal views on what the law has done over the past 5 years. And as Susanna said, I think there are weaknesses, there are ambiguities that we see with hindsight, but there also has been great progress. So if we look at the market, yes, it's played its part. Yes, I think it probably can do more. And yes, I think that is happening, but perhaps in ways we didn't really expect. In terms of cross-border offerings and the cost of market-driven services and products and so on, we have seen more innovation for sure. We have seen an increase in cross-border offerings, helped to an extent, certainly by member states exchanging experiences and recommendations themselves with each other. And the cost of monitoring was really a concern, I think, for the member states back in 2016, but also in 2018 when I started to get involved. And that has not been flagged as a concern in practice. So I think there the market has stepped up, and that's one of the impacts we wanted to see from the directive. In terms of simplified monitoring, which is one of the most obvious market tools, the automated monitoring to detect non-compliance, I think it's safe to say that has not proved the silver bullet that some hoped for back when the text was being drafted. As probably everyone here knows, and pardon the pun, automated tests are usually blind to the severity of the fault detected. And a list of no's or a list of fails can be both demotivating for the website owner, but also it fails to identify the errors that need to be addressed to turn a non-accessible website into a reasonably accessible website. So it lacks that hierarchization. And automated testing often focuses on visual impairment and can neglect other needs, particularly cognitive impairment. So not ideal yet. In terms of skills, we still need many, many more professionals. Now, IAAP does a fantastic job and their certification is very, very welcome and necessary, but we still need more embedded training and awareness raising on universal design and accessibility across all relevant sectors. And that's despite recent Commission and Member States' efforts to really increase the total number of ICT professionals up to 20 million by 2030. No, spoiler, I don't think we're going to get there. But also the clear market need for accessibility specialists. We still haven't got that breakthrough we'd hoped for. Things improving, but slowly. However, there have been new innovations. And as we've seen, automated speech translation and transcription have improved enormously in recent years, making multilingual video captioning easier than ever, as we see today. And that is relevant both to the WAD, but also to the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. And I think it's one case where we see technology advancing regardless of the law. And through the Commission's Language Tools platform, and Susanna very kindly is going to share links in the chat to some of the things I'm referencing here, we offer free tools for translation, transcription, subtitling, easy to read text simplification. So there is a lot of work going on with that to make these tools available. And we also really welcome the ongoing work by WCAG on WCAG 3 as far as it concerns clear language. Because then that will be a very welcome addition to the whole WCAG texts. And as we'll hear also this afternoon, which is very exciting, AI for creating code could be brilliant if it leads to in-depth accessibility by default and by design. And it could be quite catastrophic if it doesn't, and we end up back in the position of having to retrofit accessibility on something that hasn't been designed with it in mind. Good news, I think, in terms of the in-depth testing as a counterpart to the automated testing, involving persons with disabilities and a range of persons with disabilities in the in-depth testing, which is the only way to prove compliance, is really now seen as essential and as standard. And this can also be a gateway to paid employment for persons with disabilities. Because sad to say, according to a recent report just published this month, that's the 2025 Employment and Social Developments in Europe report, of the 44 million working age persons with disabilities, 56% worked in 2024 compared to 84% of people without disabilities. So we're talking more, well, nearly a 30 percentage point gap there. And we know that this is linked to poverty and social exclusion and lots of other things. So getting persons with disabilities who want to work into the workplace is important. Testing can be one way of doing that. And the law itself is not perfect, as Susanna said. Monitoring especially can seem very messy. The law is quite future-proof and quite standard by using that general definition of accessibility criteria as being perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, the POUR criteria. And that, in the case of the WAD, is backed by the harmonised standard, which gives the presumption of conformity based on those very detailed, long pages of specific accessibility issues. But we saw from the review in 2022, and we see continuously, that how that harmonised standard fits with the WCAG guidelines is not always obvious to anyone. But we have tried to explain that with an online text, which Susanna's going to share. And it's not just that interplay between WCAG and the standard, it's also the clarity and of some of the legal text. So the implementing decision talk says that the annual monitoring period for both websites and mobile applications shall be between 1st of January, 22nd of December. Great. But it isn't clear if member states should monitor all year, for a week, a day, a month, between that January and December period. The sample size and the recurring sample, they are spelled out in order to be fair and give year-on-year some comparison, but the wording isn't always understood in the same way by the member states. And that balance and the benefit of the simplified testing and the in-depth testing, I'm not sure it's perfect, again, with the 2020 vision of hindsight. And all this makes comparing member states' reports against each other more difficult, which is, of course, a tool to ensure transparency and to encourage, the sort of best in class and who could do better. And then there's also the issue of when is compliant and when is it fully compliant? And this is partly on us because the implementing decision on the accessibility statement mentions three categories: full, partial, or non-compliance. And that absolutist classification, if you like, you've got heaven, purgatory, and hell, isn't really helpful because virtually everyone, and certainly over when we started, was in the purgatory of partially compliant. And that covered everything from the basic minimum to the very nearly perfect. And showing progress when you're in partially compliant is very difficult, virtually invisible. And so some member states, I think, very wisely have addressed that issue by creating different subcategories themselves so they can monitor and demonstrate progress. And they've also defined a category of fully compliant where a small number of minor and non-blocking errors are explicitly tolerated. I think we might say that perfect is the enemy of the good if we treat all errors alike, whether they're blocking or non-blocking. And that's our current wording. Because showing progress is really crucial to keep encouraging public sector bodies to keep on making progress. And we've seen good results from member states that have set up league tables and shared monitoring results in a transparent way to encourage positive and friendly rivalry and competition between authorities, and so motivate those authorities to keep on keeping on with accessibility. And then, as Susanna touched, there is this question of the carrot and the stick. Is there one, and who holds it, if there is? Because really the burden of ensuring correct implementation by the public sector bodies, I think, lies very heavily on individuals and civil society organisations, such as EDF and their membership organisations. That they hold public sector bodies to account, that they complain when they spot a problem, they give this feedback, and they follow up if that feedback isn't received well with open arms. And that is a lot to ask. There's a lot of energy required in that. And so we see, I think, not surprisingly, the feedback mechanism, which is a key tool really to making the WOD work, and which should be clearly described in the accessibility statement. That feedback mechanism is not as widely known or used across the EU as we had expected 5 years ago. And in fact, for the public sector bodies, having a good, clear and monitored accessibility statement that shows how an alternative format can be requested, as well as how to raise feedback and submit feedback, can be a very easy and practical solution, as long as that alternative pathway works, of course. And I think somehow the value and the role of the accessibility statements can be underestimated. However, having said all that, I think progress has been made and continues to be made, primarily due to the fantastic work of the member states' colleagues working on the ground in this. 5 years on, and others much more expert and objective than me, like the monitoring agencies, IAAP themselves, and I'm very much looking forward to hear what our speaker from EDF has to say. They do say they see progress when they're comparing monitoring reports, when they're doing audits of websites and apps, and when they're talking to end users. And they confirm that the public sector bodies are trying their best. Many of the basic accessibility mistakes that we used to see almost everywhere 5 years ago are no longer found in most websites. So the overall code quality and thereby technical accessibility is increasing. There's also been an increase in professional certification as this becomes a more obvious requirement for procurers and recruiters alike, also fueled by the effective start date of the European Accessibility Act on 28th of June this year. And there's also been progress in legislation. I think we can claim that the WOD has laid the foundation and showed that more is possible. We have the European Accessibility Act, which, while I'm not going to go into the details, is an interesting comparison to the WAD as it was adopted in 2019. And as Susanna said, scope is bigger. In the EAA, addressed to the private sector, we have Article 30, which explicitly authorises effective, proportionate and dissuasive penalties. Because it's the private sector, goods can be withdrawn from the market. And in the annexes, it has an overview of the accessibility requirements and an indicative list of non-binding examples of possible solutions. So something midway between the POUR criteria and the harmonised standards, the detailed ones that Susanna's explained, that still provide for presumption of conformity. It's an interesting approach. And in this context, I must give a shout out to Accessible EU, because they are providing training and support material on the EAA. It's a key Commission initiative mentioned in the strategy for the rights of persons with disabilities, which is still in force until 2030. If you don't know them already, they have a community of practice via LinkedIn, a newsletter, a resource centre. They organise countless events across the EU. Please check them out if you don't know them. And last but not least, I'd also give a brief mention of the Digital Services Act, where work is just starting on Article 47, which obliges the Commission to encourage the development of codes of conduct to address the particular needs of persons with disabilities. And this is an act, a horizontal act that applies to all service intermediaries, so the big social media platforms and many, many more. So that could be very, very interesting development as well. But I'd like to end, and I hope I'm on time, by sharing one example I came across in Ireland this summer. And it's just one small example, but I hope it's representative of all the great work that's going across in the member states, all across Europe. Now, the project is a health passport app to allow for people for whom communication is difficult, people with dementia, people with learning difficulties, people for whom English is not their first language, to interact easily and safely when accessing healthcare or communicating with healthcare professionals. It started out as a paper passport in 2019, before the WAD was an application, and it's been updated recently as a nationwide app to which the WAD does apply. Now, it lets people very simply encode key information into the app, which is the online passport, and so that information can be shared in advance, for example, emailing it ahead of an appointment or on the spot in case of an emergency. It helps the patient, it helps the healthcare staff, and it's a big reassurance for any carers involved. And in promoting the app, the Irish Health Service Executive offers captioning on a very nice, easy to understand video. They offer sign language on that video. They offer easy to read formats. And their flyers, which I happen to have one here, are double-sided. So you have the normal text and easy to read text on the reverse. And I think that attitude, that approach towards communication is something all of us in the public sector should ideally be doing as standard, and really on all topics. Now, I discovered the app while visiting my 27-year-old daughter in hospital in Dublin, where she spent over 10 weeks this summer recovering from sudden and severe sepsis. It was a very powerful reminder for me that disability can hit any of us at any age, at any time, and really without warning. Now, I know the member states have been sincere and committed in making this law work with the resources that are allocated to them. To all the developers and designers listening in, and really to all of us with able-bodied privilege, the day can come when we or our loved ones suddenly move from finding those accessibility features like audiobooks or subtitling useful to finding them absolutely essential. So let's together, please, continue to design, develop, and deploy technology to make a more accessible and inclusive digital world for everyone, because you just might be glad one day that you did. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Susanna.